Mike Tyson, has broken his silence on Don King's health, and the update is leaving boxing fans concerned. The former heavyweight champion recently revealed he had spoken with King, and what he shared about the 93-year-old promoter wasn't what many were expecting. Let me explain. It started, as most seismic things in boxing do, with a podcast. Tyson showed up on Cameron and Mace's show in September 2024, and someone asked how King was doing. Iron Mike didn't flinch. He told the hosts that Don was not doing well right now, and then he added, in that quiet Tyson way that lands harder than any jab, that King was probably close to 100 years old. 2 sentences. That's all it took to set the boxing world on fire. TMZ moved fast. Within hours, their sources confirmed what Tyson had hinted at. King had just come off a 10-day stint in the hospital and had received a blood transfusion. He was back home recovering, but sources close to him weren't painting a rosy picture. The man who once commanded rooms full of presidents, world champions, and TV executives was now resting at his Palm Beach County home, hooked to medical equipment. His wild white hair, the only thing still broadcasting that unmistakable Don King energy. The photos that spread online told their own story. King on a couch, an IV line, oxygen tubing running across his face, medical monitors on his chest. He looked like a man at war with his own body, and for the first time in decades, nobody could tell who was winning. The boxing world, which had spent the better part of 50 years loving and hating this man in equal measure, went completely still. Cameron pushed further and asked Tyson about where things actually stood between the two of them now. Tyson told him they had spoken, and that at the end of it, they had told each other they loved each other. That phrase, at the end of the game, we love each other, hit different when you know the full weight of history between these two men. This wasn't just a promoter and his fighter patching things up. This was the reunification of 2 tectonic plates that had been grinding against each other for decades, shredding everything in between. Cameron asked the question everyone in the room was thinking: did Tyson feel any differently now about King having taken advantage of him? Tyson paused, and then he said something that surprised everyone, including himself. He said, "I believe Don King pretty much educated me. That will never happen again." Not bitterness, not rage, just a cold, clear-eyed acknowledgement that the con had made him smarter. You almost had to respect it. Within days, King's company, DK Productions, issued a statement to World Boxing News. It said that Don King wanted all his friends and boxing fans to know he was doing fine at his home in Palm Beach County. And then came the line that became the most talked-about sentence in boxing that week. King's personal addendum to the statement. "Tell everyone I'm doing fine, and I love Mike Tyson." 5 words of reciprocity from the man Tyson had once said he waited to die. The internet stopped scrolling. Larry Holmes, one of King's most financially ravaged victims, had for years called King every name in the book. Holmes once said King looks black, lives white, and thinks green. A line that became the unofficial tagline of an entire era of exploitation. Holmes alleged that across his career, King had cheated him out of $10 million in fight purses, secretly positioning himself as a hidden manager, taking 25% cuts he was never contractually owed. Evander Holyfield, another King fighter, watched his own earnings bleed through contracts that seemed more designed to feed Don King Productions than to reward the man doing the actual fighting. Terry Norris went to court over it. Norris sued King in 1996, agreed to let the terms be made public. One of the contracts was completely blank when he signed it. Blank. And yet Witherspoon signed because the alternative was being blackballed out of boxing entirely. 5. So when Tyson goes on a podcast in 2024 and says he and King love each other, the reactions were not what you'd call universal warmth. The boxing community had seen this movie before. King had a gift, his only true gift that wasn't connected to money, for making men feel that his exploitation of them was somehow their fault, or their education, or just the price of doing business. Randall Tex Cobb, the heavyweight who once fought Holmes in one of the ugliest bouts in the sport's history, put it best when he described King with a quote that has circulated boxing circles ever since. Cobb said of King that if you had a quarter, he wants the first 26 cents. Holmes himself eventually dropped the diplomatic framing entirely and declared that King was an equal opportunity dirtbag. He screws everybody. And then there was Tyson's own 2001 ESPN profile verdict, the true sellout who did more bad to black fighters than any white promoter ever in the history of boxing. Now, in 2024, that same man was saying they loved each other. The internet couldn't decide whether to be moved or disgusted. 6. The boxing world had 3 very different reactions, and they played out in real time online. One camp, mostly older boxing fans who'd lived through the King era, said this was Tyson finally growing up, choosing peace over prolonged bitterness. They pointed out that Tyson himself had destroyed his own finances long before King got his hands on the wreckage. King's defense during the lawsuit had always been that Tyson's financial ruin wasn't from theft, but from spending. Tigers, jewelry, mansions, cocaine. https://www.cigaraficionado.com's articles Grudge Match Tyson vs King 6164. That argument never fully landed, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. The second camp was the boxing purists, analysts and writers who'd spent careers documenting King's systematic extraction of wealth from black athletes. They saw Tyson's "I love you" not as forgiveness, but as the final act of a man who'd been conditioned over decades to make peace with his abuser. They pointed to the pattern: Ali, Holmes, Norris, Witherspoon, Holyfield, Tyson. Almost every major fighter King ever promoted eventually sued him. https://nbequipedio.org /wiki King, and almost every single one of them settled out of court, quietly, for a fraction of what they'd actually lost. Because this wasn't just a business dispute. This was 2 men in their twilight, one dying and one aging, making peace through the only language boxing ever taught them: power, survival, and the briefest possible acknowledgement of pain. Tyson told Cameron and Mace that he knows now what to look out for, that the experience was an education, and that whatever happened, that's not going to happen again. https://www.yahoo.com/entertainment/legendary boxing promoter Don King 222,039,795.html. A lesson paid for in tens of millions of dollars. Part 2. The Man Behind the Hair. 7. To understand why Tyson's words on that podcast carry so much weight, you have to understand what Don King actually was before he ever put a championship belt on anybody. Because the man who became boxing's most recognizable promoter didn't come from the world of sports management or entertainment. He came from Cleveland, Ohio, born on August 20, 1931, the 5th of 6 children, raised in poverty after his father was killed in a workplace accident when a ladle of molten steel exploded at the Otis Steel Plant. https://nbequipedio.org Don King. His mother sold peanuts and homemade pies. The family relocated to the middle-class Mount Pleasant neighborhood on the insurance payout from his father's death. King and his brothers all eventually became involved in illegal numbers running, the street lottery that funded Cleveland's underground economy for decades. https://nbequipedio.org/wiki Don King. This wasn't a brief detour for King. It was his training ground. He learned how money moved, how information was weaponized, how charm could lower a mark's guard long enough to take everything they had. Those lessons never left him. He dropped out of Kent State University and ran a numbers operation out of the basement of a record store. He was charged with killing 2 men in separate incidents 13 years apart. https://nbequipedio.org/wiki Don King I. In 1954 was ruled justifiable homicide after he shot a man trying to rob one of his gambling houses. The second, in 1967, was not. King stomped one of his own employees to death over a $600 debt. He was convicted of second-degree murder, later reduced to manslaughter. He served 3 years and 11 months in prison. https://nbequipedio.org/wiki Don King. And then, as only Don King could manage, he walked out of prison and into the most powerful seat in boxing within a decade. 8. Prison is where King became a reader. He devoured books on law, on history, on rhetoric. By the early 1970s, he had leveraged a friendship with Muhammad Ali into the boxing world's most valuable backstage pass. The story of how he got his first major fight promotion is itself a lesson in King's genius for inserting himself into rooms where he didn't belong. He organized a 1974 benefit boxing match featuring Ali, ostensibly for a Cleveland hospital. But that same event put him in the room with the most powerful man in sports, and from there, everything accelerated. In 1974, King promoted the Rumble in the Jungle, Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman in Zaire, and followed it the next year with the Thrilla in Manila, Ali versus Joe Frazier in the Philippines, https://nbiquidbiquideo.org quas wiki Don King, two of the greatest sporting events in the 20th century, organized back-to-back by a man who just years earlier had been serving time for manslaughter. It was an American story so wild that no screenwriter would dare pitch it, signing fighter after fighter to contracts that gave them the spotlight while quietly channeling the bulk of the revenue back through his own company. Throughout that decade, he assembled a roster including Larry Holmes, Wilfred Benitez, Roberto Duran, Salvador Sanchez, Wilfredo Gomez, and Alexis Arguello, fighters who would all eventually reach Hall of Fame status. https://nbingwikipedia.org Swirg Wik Don King. King didn't just promote champions. He positioned himself not just as a promoter, but as a de facto manager, sometimes through his stepson Carl King, sometimes through shell agreements buried in contracts that fighters signed without proper legal representation. Tim Witherspoon, for example, signed 4 contracts of servitude without a lawyer present. Documents that gave the King family a total management cut exceeding what most boxing commissions even permitted. https://nbiquidbiquideo.org swerkwikd. One contract was blank at the time of signing. Witherspoon was told to sign anyway, under threat of being blackballed from the sport. The pattern repeated itself with alarming consistency. Witherspoon was promised $150, zero for his fight against Larry Holmes, but received only $52,750. https://ndenwikipedia.org/wiki Don King. Holmes himself, after the same fight, found King had quietly deducted a $300, zero finder's fee from his own purse. He sued. He settled for $150, zero, and crucially signed a legal agreement pledging never to publicly criticize King again. King was buying silence as routinely as he was buying fighters. What makes the whole architecture of King's system so breathtaking in retrospect is how rarely it collapsed in court. Despite being charged with tax evasion, insurance fraud, and facing an FBI investigation into fight fixing for rankings in 1999, King was never convicted of felony fraud. https://boxrec.com/wik index php Don King. He beat indictments. He settled lawsuits. He paid men to stay quiet. He turned the law into just another negotiating table, and at that table, he almost always won. 10. Muhammad Ali's experience with King foreshadowed everything that came after. In 1982, Ali sued King for underpaying him by $1.1 million for his comeback fight against Larry Holmes. https://nbiquidbiquideo.org swishtig Don King. It should have been a straightforward claim, but King was never straightforward. He sent an intermediary, an old friend of Ali's named Jeremiah Shabazz, to the hospital where Ali was being treated for his failing health. Shabazz arrived with a suitcase containing $50, zero in cash, and a letter that, if signed, would drop the entire lawsuit. Ali was ailing. He was mumbling. He needed money. He signed. https://nbiquidbiquideo.org/wiki Don King. The letter didn't just drop the lawsuit, it gave King the right to promote any of Ali's future fights. Ali's own lawyer cried when he found out. Shabazz later said he regretted the whole thing. But the money was gone. The signature was real. And Don King walked away from a $1 million lawsuit for $50,000 and a piece of paper. That move, exploiting a man's physical vulnerability to dissolve a financial claim, would echo for decades. Because when you look at the pattern across Ali, Holmes, Norris, Witherspoon, Holyfield, and finally Tyson, you see the same instinct repeating. Find the weakness, apply pressure at precisely the right moment, and walk away whole. King didn't just promote fights. He fought every day in courtrooms and conference rooms and hospital hallways. and he almost never lost. Part 3. Iron Mike walks into the machine. 11. Mike Tyson came into Don King's orbit in 1988, and by that point, Tyson was already the most dangerous man alive. He'd become the youngest heavyweight champion in history, had dismantled every challenger put in front of him, and was generating revenue that the sport had never seen before. https://www.worldboxingnews.com. Mike Tyson assured 100-year-old Don King doing fine. The problem was that Tyson's previous management team, led by the legendary trainer Cus D'Amato, and later Bill Caton and Jim Jacobs, had been the only thing standing between him and people like King. D'Amato died in 1985. Jacobs died in 1988, and in that window of grief and vulnerability, with Tyson already being pulled in every direction by hangers-on and bad influences, King moved in. He arrived with the full arsenal: charm, cash, promises. Tyson grew up in severe poverty and had almost no financial literacy. So after global fame hit, he trusted his promoter to manage not just his career but his money. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news. Everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King, relationship, court case, altercation, and more for a while. The partnership worked, at least in terms of spectacle. King and Tyson together made hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars. https://www.sportscasting.com snooze. The day a cocaine-fueled Mike Tyson kicked promoter Don King in the skull. The fights were massive. The pay-per-view numbers were historic. The press conferences were theater. But underneath all of it, the same mechanism that King had run on Ali and Holmes and Witherspoon was already running on Tyson. Quietly, steadily, invisibly to anyone who didn't have access to the books. What? There was a phrase that circulated inside Don King Productions when it came to how expenses were assigned. Joseph Mafia, who served as the head comptroller for the company, later testified about it. He said the company motto was CBMT, Charge Back Mike Tyson. https://www.cigaraficionado.com's article Grudge Match Tyson vs King 6000. Renovations to King's home. Salaries for King's family members on the DKP payroll. Undercard fighters. Legal fees. All of it. Tyson's lawsuit would later allege that King had defrauded him through 2 massive contracts with Showtime, negotiated right after Tyson was released from prison in 1995. The suit alleged that King concealed revenue from the non-US broadcast rights of Tyson's fights and had charged him for millions in expenses, including renovations to King's own home and office. https://www.murphyfalcon.com's results. Murphy Falcon. Murphy represents boxing promoter Don King sued by Mike Tyson for fraud and theft. The full scope of what Tyson claims was taken from him over a decade-plus relationship was, by his own accounting, at least $100 million. What makes this especially brutal is the timing. He was in legal jeopardy on multiple fronts. His personal finances were catastrophic. He owed $38.4 million to various creditors, including the IRS and his ex-wife Monica. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news. Everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King, relationship, court case, altercation, and more. The $14 million settlement he eventually received from King in 2004 didn't go to Tyson personally. It went directly toward paying off those mounting debts. He didn't see a dollar of it. Here's the other piece that rarely gets discussed when people talk about the Tyson-King lawsuit. Tyson wasn't exactly a passive victim in the destruction of his own fortune. King's defense team pointed this out with considerable force, that Tyson's lifestyle, independent of any fraud, was itself a financial catastrophe. He spent over $400 a year on pet supplies alone. https://www.cigaraficionado.com's article Grudge Match Tyson vs King 6164. He bought mansions in multiple states, an enormous collection of luxury cars. That complexity is exactly what made the lawsuit so hard to litigate and so easy for King to survive. Because in a courtroom, the books were managed by King's people. The contracts were negotiated by King's lawyers. Tyson, by his own admission, didn't understand what he was signing or what was being done with his money for the better part of a decade. He grew increasingly aware of what was happening only as his wealth began to visibly shrink. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news. Everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King relationship, court case, altercation, and more. The final accounting, such as it was, came in the form of a $14 million settlement in 2004. Tyson had sued for $100 million. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news. Everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King relationship, court case, altercation, and more. He settled for 14. That money went to creditors, and then Mike Tyson, who had once been the highest-paid athlete in the world, filed for bankruptcy, listing debts of $23 million, a number that in his peak years he could have earned in a single night. That's the legacy of the partnership. Billions generated, and the man who generated them ended up with nothing. 14. The breaking point didn't arrive quietly. It arrived in 2003 on a Florida highway in a Rolls-Royce, with Tyson high on cocaine and every unprocessed grievance of a decade tumbling out at once. Tyson and King had agreed to meet to discuss a possible reconciliation and a potential new $20 million promotional deal. https://www.sportscasting.com's news. The day a cocaine-fueled Mike Tyson kicked promoter Don King in the skull, Tyson took King's private jet to Florida. King picked him up at the airport, one of dozens of small humiliations that had stacked up in Tyson's mind. Tyson described the moment in his 2013 autobiography, Undisputed Truth. They were driving down the I-95 from Fort Lauderdale to Miami. King said something minor, and all of it just came flooding out. https://atlantablackstar.com, Strut 2024-10-1. Mike Tyson put Don King in a jealous chokehold for taking advantage of him. He kicked King in the head. Then he choked him from the back seat. Tyson ended up on the side of the I-95 with cocaine in his pockets and a full police presence arriving, but it never fully held. Until, apparently, that phone call in 2024, the one where they told each other they loved each other. https://www.mensjournal.com news. Boxing promoter Don King health issues. Mike Tyson, 2 decades of wreckage. Part 4. The system that ate them all. 15. To frame what happened to Tyson as a one-off, as the misfortune of one financially illiterate fighter who trusted the wrong man, is to completely misread what Don King actually was. King was not an anomaly in boxing. He was the apex of a system that the sport had always used to extract wealth from the athletes who generated it. https://nbkibidil.org Swick Wig Don King. What made him different was scale, staying power, and an almost total immunity to legal consequence. Consider the breadth: Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Evander Holyfield, Julio Cesar Chavez, Roy Jones Jr., Felix Trinidad, Bernard Hopkins, Marco Antonio Barrera, Terry Norris, Tim Witherspoon. These are the most decorated names in the history of professional boxing across 3 decades, and almost all of them sued King for defrauding them. https://cn.wikipedia.org Juergwace Wichgi Don King. King settled most lawsuits for 6 to 8-digit payoffs while never once being convicted of felony fraud. The insurance fraud charge in 1995 is a case study in how King operated under legal pressure. The charge alleged that King had illegally collected $350 from Lloyd's of London for a cancelled Chavez fight. https://boxrec.com/which gives index php Don King. The trial ended in a hung jury. King walked. A few months later, he beat a 9-count indictment on the same matter. In 1999, the FBI searched his Florida offices as part of an investigation into whether King had paid for favorable rankings from sanctioning bodies. https://boxrec.com Wakey whichindex.php Don King emerged untouched. He quipped at the time that he didn't want to fight the FBI unless he could promote the event at Madison Square Garden, 16. The mechanism behind King's power over rankings is worth dwelling on, because it explains how he could simultaneously exploit his own fighters and lock out any competition. If you controlled the rankings by paying Ring magazine to falsify records, by bribing sanctioning body officials, by managing both sides of a fight through shell management companies, you controlled who got title shots, who got the big paydays, and who rotted on the undercard until they gave up. King was accused at various points of paying Ring magazine to falsify the track records and rankings of fighters to bolster his own promotional events. https://www.complex.com Sports A Flow Complex A History of Don King's Gramiest Moments. This is the part of King's story that doesn't get enough attention because it's less dramatic than the lawsuits and the violence. But it's arguably more damaging in total terms. Every fighter who got a manufactured ranking instead of an earned one displaced a fighter who'd actually won it. Every title shot sold through a corrupted process devalued the championship itself. King didn't just steal money from his fighters. Jack Newfield's biography, The Life and Crimes of Don King, The Shame of Boxing in America, published in 1995, tried to do exactly that. It painted a portrait not just of a corrupt promoter, but of a corrupt ecosystem, sanctioning bodies, managers, television networks, and fighters themselves, all bound together in a web of dependencies that made King nearly impossible to dislodge. https://www.cigaraficionado.com Articles Grudge Match Tyson vs King 6164. King's response was to launch a $2.5 billion defamation suit against ESPN for broadcasting a documentary based in part on Newfield's work. He didn't win that suit, but the message was clear. Come at King, and he'd bury you in litigation. 17. The fighters who suffered most under this system shared a common vulnerability. They came from poverty. They had no financial education, and they were handed sudden, and had almost no understanding of contracts or finances when King entered his life. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King relationship, court case, altercation, and more. That wasn't an accident of King's targeting. It was the criterion. The men who were hardest to exploit were the ones who came in with their own lawyers, their own management structures, and their own financial advisors independent of King. Those men got shorter promotional runs, less prominent cards, fewer of the mega fights. King naturally steered his most lucrative events toward fighters who were easier to control. The system was almost elegant in its logic. The more dependent a fighter was on King for guidance, the more King could extract from them without detection. And when those fighters eventually noticed, as they all eventually did, the pattern of response was also consistent. King would countersue. He'd offer a settlement with a silence clause attached. He'd use the fighter's own financial desperation against him. Timing settlement offers for the moments when debts were most crushing. Holmes settled for $150, and signed an agreement pledging never to publicly criticize King again. https://inbigpedial.org/wiki Don King. The payment wasn't just a settlement, it was a gag order. 18. The Don King story forced a conversation in boxing that the sport's power structure was deeply reluctant to have, that the exploitation of black athletes by the promotional system wasn't incidental but structural. And the most uncomfortable part of that conversation was that the most prolific exploiter was himself a black man. That's precisely what made Tyson's 2001 ESPN quote so electrifying, calling King the true sellout who did more bad to black fighters than any white promoter ever in the history of boxing. https://nbetwipidio.org.wiki// Don King response to that framing, consistently across decades, was to wrap himself in the language of black empowerment. He'd quote Frederick Douglass. He'd argue that Don King Productions was one of the most successful black-owned businesses in America, and that the attacks on him were really attacks on black success dressed up in legal language. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1997 and was named the greatest promoter in history by the WBC, WBA, and IBF https://boxric.com/wiki-index-dintex-bait-index-bhp Tyson-King. The sport's governing bodies, the same ones he'd allegedly paid to fix rankings, gave him the highest honor in the game. There's a version of Don King's legacy that is genuinely complicated. He did put on fights that would not have happened without him. He did promote black fighters in an era when the sport's major infrastructure was controlled entirely by white promoters and television executives. The Rumble in the Jungle and the Thrilla in Manila are two of the most watched sporting events in human history. https://nnbkidil.org/wikis logobrog wik Don King. He made those happen. And while he was making them happen, he was also systematically underpaying the men who fought in them. Both things are true. That tension is Don King's entire legacy. Part 5. Two Old Men and What's Left. 19. By September 2024, when Tyson's podcast appearance set off the wave of concern, Don King was 93 years old and facing health complications that his own team was scrambling to get ahead of. The hospitalization had lasted 10 days. The blood transfusion was real. https://www.tmz.com's2024-920w.Don King Health Issues. The statement from DK Productions professional, measured, insisting he was fine, couldn't fully conceal the anxiety behind it. When a man of 93 needs a blood transfusion after a 10-day hospital stay, fine is doing an enormous amount of work. King's public statement carried that one line about loving Tyson, and the boxing world sat with it. King's own company confirmed he was recovering at his Palm Beach County home and was already back to working on scheduling a WBC cruiserweight title fight between Noel Mikhailian and Ryan Rozicki. https://www.worldboxingnews.com's Mike Tyson assured 100-year-old Don King doing fine. That detail landed as both reassuring and somehow perfectly King at 93. Post-blood transfusion, still trying to make a fight happen. And then in March 2025, the boxing world lost George Foreman. King, who had his own health complications and had been thought seriously ill just weeks before, posted a tribute on social media, https://callandpost.com/2025-331 Don King mourns George Foreman. He called Foreman a wonderful man, a great imaginative human being. He spoke about God, about dreams, about the underprivileged rising to make something of themselves. And then he closed with a line that landed like a heavy right hand, referencing his own mortality, telling Foreman to keep a light on in the window. I will be there to see you soon. https://callandpost.com/2025-331 Do Don King mourns George Foreman, Don King, looking at his own finish line. 20 Tyson, meanwhile, spent the months around that podcast appearance preparing for his Netflix fight against Jake Paul, a strange Twilight chapter of his own, including an ulcer flare-up that forced the fight to be postponed from July. https://www.unilid.com/noshnews/smorsmarsmark Mike Tyson Health latest Don King 739,003 to 20,240,000. The two men, Tyson and King, had become, in these twilight years, something entirely different from what they'd been in their prime. In their prime, they were a partnership built on power and money, and the constant negotiation of who controlled whom. Now they were two aging men with decades of shared history, enormous mutual damage, and apparently genuine affection threading through all of it. King himself had expressed excitement about Tyson's return to boxing before the podcast even aired, telling the Daily Mail he hoped the reported $40 million payday for Tyson was accurate. https://www.thesportster.com's Mike Tyson's controversial relationship Don King. He wanted Tyson to get paid. After everything, what you're left with, looking at all of it, the fraud, the lawsuits, the chokehold on an I-95 highway, the bankruptcy, the blood transfusion, the I love you, is something that doesn't fit neatly into any category boxing gives you. It isn't forgiveness exactly. Tyson was clear enough about that. He said King educated him, not that he exonerated him. He said the experience made him wiser, not that it didn't hurt. And King, for his part, from a couch in Palm Beach County with oxygen tubing across his face, sent back 3 words: "I love him, not. I'm sorry. Not. I was wrong. Just love." The only currency he'd ever truly spent freely. The photos circulating online, King on that couch, monitors on his chest, looking smaller and quieter than any version of himself the public had ever seen, were confrontational in their own way. Because for 50 years, Don King was the biggest person in any room he entered, not because of physical size, but because of sheer force of personality and will. To see that force diminished, held together with medical tubing, was its own kind of reckoning. King, born August 20, 1931, in Cleveland, Ohio, https://nmbkedio.org square wiki Don King, the boy who ran numbers from a record store basement, who was named the greatest promoter in history by the very bodies he allegedly corrupted, is now an old man resting at home. And the man who once waited for him to die sat down on a podcast and told the world he hoped he didn't. References: Mike Tyson assured 100-year-old Don King is doing fine. Right https://www.worldboxingnews.com's Mike Tyson assured 100-year-old Don King doing fine. Legendary boxing promoter Don King battling health issues. TMZ, https://www.tmz.com's 2024 920.over ish Don King health issues. Gul Don King Wikipedia, https://nbig Wikipedia arg https://glowing Wikipedia Don King. Mike Tyson says Don King. Legendary boxing promoter, not doing well amid health issues. Men's Journal, https://www.mensjournal.com. Snooze boxing promoter Don King health issues. Mike Tyson receives message from Don King following concerning health update. UNILAD, https://www.unitlad.com. Snooze floor sesh Mike Tyson health latest. Don King 739,003 to 20,240,925. Legendary boxing promoter Don King is not doing well amid health issues. Mike Tyson says Yahoo Entertainment, https://www.yeo.com/entertainment/legendary boxing promoter Dian Ging Ting 222,039,795.html. Iconic boxing promoter Don King says he's doing fine amid Mike Tyson's comments. Bleacher Report, https://bleacherreport.com's articles /10,136,273. Iconic boxing promoter Don King says he's doing fine amid Mike Tyson's coggins. Mike Tyson reveals legendary boxing promoter Don King had to be hospitalized amid health concerns. Euroweb, https://euroweb.com/Don King was hospitalized due to health problems. Don King says he's fine after hospitalization. Fox Bangor, https://www.foxbangor.com/news/national entertainment. Don King says he's fine after hospitalization, despite concerns over health. Article BC7C 0719 3000. 798 562D9F24 B5F96C4 Phi or A808 HTML. Don King mourns George Foreman. Call and post. https://callandpost.com St 2025-331 D. Don King mourns George Foreman. Everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King. Essentially Sports. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news. Everything that happened between Mike Tyson and Don King relationship, court case, altercation, and more. Grudge match Tyson versus King. Cigar aficionado. https://www.cigaraficionado.com/articles grudge match Tyson vs King 6000. 164. The day a cocaine-fueled Mike Tyson kicked promoter Don King in the skull. Sportscasting https://www.sportscasting.com. News, the day a cocaine-fueled Mike Tyson kicked promoter Don King in the skull. Mike Tyson kicked Don King in the head during explosive fight. Atlanta Blackstar, https://atalantablackstar.com/2024-10-1 Mike Tyson put Don King in a jealous chokehold for taking advantage of him. Mike Tyson's controversial relationship with Don King. Explained. The Sportster, https://www.thesportster.com's Mike Tyson's controversial relationship. Don King. Vol boxing promoter Don King sued by Mike Tyson for fraud and theft. Murphy Falcon and Murphy. https://www.murphyfalcon.com's results. Murphy Falcon Murphy represents boxing promoter Don King sued by Mike Tyson for fraud and theft. A history of Don King's grimiest moments complex. https://www.complex.com sports a Olva complex a history of Don King's grimiest moments. Don King box rec. https://boxrec.com/wiki index.php zalk Don King's grimiest.may port ep each ks key x day pek Don King hesk where is Don King now? AOL people. https://www.aol.com/Warkles Where Don King Tent Now Promoters 113,813.html D Ohio Boxing Promoter Don King facing $3 billion lawsuit WKBN https://www.ukbn.com News Close Ohio Boxing Promoter Don King facing $3 billion lawsuit Article BC7C0719 3798 562 D9 F24B5 F96C44 ASAI HTML